All right, so we're going to get started right on time. Thanks everyone for coming. So we have quite a panel for you here. We have Antonio Neri, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. And here we have Amy Webb, who's an adjunct assistant professor at NYU Stern School of Business and an author who has a book coming out very soon. I believe it's called The Big Nine.
It is. It's all about the future of AI.
There you go. Okay, good. And then Jeremy O'Brien is the Chief Executive Officer of Psi Quantum Computing Corp. Psi Corp. Good. Okay, so I kind of want to try to thread a needle with this panel, which is to say I would like to bask in a little techno-optimism. It's fun for me to do, I think maybe for some of you here. But also, I also want to address the threats and ethical challenges that all these advances will certainly bring to our society, and also really just separate the hype from reality as best we can. But before all that, I kind of want to get everyone up to speed. So we talked about this. Let's kind of just do a quick state of the state in where we are in computing, and bonus points if you can help me define terms like quantum computing, neuromorphic computing, and photonic. Those are new to me. Well, quantum isn't, but those other two are. So let's go. Let's do it. Okay.
So maybe I can kick off with quantum computing.
Please, Jeremy. Thank you.
First one on your list.
Yeah.
So I think quantum computing is nothing short of a necessary tool that humans need to invent their future. Although it's got the word computing in it, I think that can be a little bit of a distraction, in the same way that were we to invent a warp drive for intergalactic travel, it would of course be a mode of transport, but to think of it in the same way as transport with automobiles and aircraft, I think would be a little bit of a mistake. So it's an entirely new technology. I think it's one of very few examples of a genuinely exponentially powerful technology. I don't care to give you a precise definition of what I mean by that, but maybe some examples will help to explain the sense of it. I think examples include things like social networks, probably Moore's law, the printing press, language, the use of fire, and there are no doubt many examples in biology as well. And the reason that I say that this is a necessary tool for humans to invent our future is if I look at just one application area of quantum computing, which is in molecular simulation and chemistry. Chemistry is applied quantum physics, and we live in a material world made out of molecules, and we are simply flailing around in a dark cave with a blindfold on without access to quantum computing. There are effectively an infinity of infinities of molecules that we could potentially synthesize, and if we're going to have a long, bright future on this planet, we better transform our activities from if I was a pessimist, I'd say that we're turning our finite resources into trash in fairly direct ways with plastic bottles, and in fairly convoluted ways with these things. And we better, in years to come, look at these things in a computer history museum or similar, and say, isn't that quaint? It's got a chassis, it's got some structural components, and there's a little battery there, and so on. We need to be building things out of materials that are not only miraculous in their single functions, but are multifunctional, so that they're part of the structure, part of the energy storage and harvesting and communications and so on. And this applies right across, human health and energy and so on. So that's a kind of applications and implications, and I'm happy to dive into some of the technical
details. Sure. So Amy, Jeremy, I think you purposely dodged my define it, because maybe it's something, but Amy, check this definition. I think in analogies and metaphors, and I actually heard from someone from HPE once say that if classic computing architecture is you read a book one page at a time, quantum computer is reading all the pages at the same time.
That's right. So here's the best way to think of it. Up until now, much of the world's information has been tethered to the original John von Neumann architecture. And in the year 2019, we're at a fascinating moment of divergence. So that means that there's an enormous amount of data that's computable in many different ways. And so there's quantum computing, and that analogy I think is terrific. There's artificial intelligence, And John McCarthy, who's one of the modern four founders of AI, used to say that we don't, once AI becomes invisible, and he said this years ago, decades ago, we no longer think of it as artificial intelligence. So here's all that you need to know about AI. Artificial intelligence is a system that makes autonomous decisions. That's it. And AI has been in some form of development for hundreds of years. So in the very modern era of AI, the reason that you're hearing about it so much so that it sounds like a sort of meaningless, buzzy trend at this moment, is because we finally have enough compute power, we have enough resources, and there's a tremendous amount of capital flowing in, which is why we have so much misplaced optimism and fear. So that's all AI is. The place that we go from here is not just AI within a single device, but AI as a service in the cloud, which is why so many of our big tech companies are moving so quickly into cloud services. There are 9 companies responsible for the future of AI. They are the ones that overwhelmingly are funding, have the lion's share of patents, are building what they call open source architectures, which you have to use on their cloud services. So it's not super open source, if you think about it that way. 3 of those companies you probably already know. They're in China. They're the BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. In the United States are the other 6. I call them the G Mafia, led by Google. And then Amazon, IBM, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft. Thank you. So that is AI. Before I hand this over, I would also just invite you to think through all of the data that we create and the various ways in which it might be computed. And there's a tremendous amount of really interesting work in biotech. And I think it would be smart of us all to start thinking of biology as a technology platform, as a computable resource as we go forward. And that kind of sort of answers your neuromorphic question. There's other more interesting things for you to be thinking about at the moment, is what I would say to that.
Okay, great. And Antonio, could you tell us a little bit about, you sometimes say that we're reaching the end of Moore's law, which I think is a good way of kind of getting into the state of things. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think we need to start where the opportunity is. And when I think about the business and society and even consumers, we have to accelerate outcomes every day, and the outcome comes from the data. Today, we generate 18 zeros of data every day. And I was talking to my fellow panelists here that 2 years from now, we're going to generate twice the amount of data we generate in human history. And when you plot that curve of data growth against the computational capacity, you will see there is a major divergence. So that's why tools like AI and others, machine learning, deep learning, are all necessary to accelerate outcomes. But we have to fundamentally solve the architectural problem, which was really based on processing algorithms, not managing this large amount of data. And so the Moore's law has worked very well because obviously every so often, call it 18 months, 2 years, we were able to pack twice the amount of transistors and reduce the size of it. Now we are in transition from 10 nanometers to 7 nanometers, eventually going to get to 4, and then what? But every time we go through those transitions, we have to deal with a fundamental problem, which is power consumption. And that's a big problem because today 6% of the global energy is utilized to power data centers, 6% of it. And so you plot this over time, you will see that by 2025, it will exceed 10%. So we have a scale problem, we have an architectural problem, and then we have an environmental problem. So we think about this, turning the model upside down. And that's why we came with the concept of memory-driven computing, where things like quantum computing will take advantage of it. But we, instead of putting the CPU at the core of the architecture, we put actually the data. And so today, for those who understand systems, you store data in a storing part of the system. You use memory, and then you access the CPU, and you go back and forth. All that generates an enormous amount of inefficiency through heating, because physics says we move electrons, and electrons generate heat. But that's very inefficient, and the scale doesn't go further than what we need now, considering all the data we are creating. So putting that memory-driven compute allows us to scale now to way bigger amounts of data, and then bring the right computational capabilities to that data, which could be in the form of quantum, it can be general purpose computing, it can be accelerators, it can be anything, but it's tailored to that specific data and the use case. And in doing so, we're actually changing a fundamental architecture that was done around copper and gold, and now we're going to go through silicon photonics, which you brought in, and instead of transferring electrons, we're going to transfer light, and that's way more efficient, which means we reduce power by a factor of 1,000 times, and we improve latency even much higher than that, and then we are able to now reduce that gap that we have between computational capacity and data, which obviously is needed because that's why we live in the world of being a data-driven, enterprise.
So what I just want to kind of circle this one a little bit because, in getting into HPE marketing materials and trying to research for this panel, I came to understand that HPE is not betting on quantum computing right now, but maybe I misunderstood. And you're more focusing on the applications level, or what is it? The way to deal with data and then
Right.
slot in different computing.
I think, as to James' points and so forth, quantum will have applicability and already has applicability. And it will be a form of computational aspects, but we are going after the fundamental problem, which is the data problem, first and foremost. How we use that data and how we extract the value of that data with an architecture that scales as the data scales. And at the same time, solving the fundamental problem of sustainability. And that's where we decided to focus first on what we call the memory-driven computing, which actually quantum will benefit, because in the end, we can bring the quantum to the data in a much more efficient way. So that's what we have done. And we already have proven the concept. Last year, we were able to demonstrate in a simple server, which is the ultimate form factor that we put in a data center in the cloud, where basically we can put 160 terabytes in one accessible set of memory and 2,000 cores, all in the same system, and be able to process a billion record database with 55 million combination on a big data analytics in less than a minute, and consume 100 times less power. So that's where we think the future is, understanding there will be different type of computational architectures around algorithms.
So let's pivot. I want to hit optimism a little bit more, which is, I want to ask, what is the most exciting thing going on because of the advancements in technology? And then, I'll follow up with this if you don't answer it now, but what should the people in the room do about it? So what should a government do based on the optimistic thing you're about to share with us? What should an entrepreneur do or a large corporation? So Jeremy, I want to hear you talk about how we can change molecules.
Sure. So yeah, I'm super optimistic about quantum computing. Just to elaborate on what Antonio was saying, I think we need to be clear that this is in no way a replacement for conventional computing. In the same way as when we developed jet aircraft, we didn't abandon automobiles. We still drive to the downtown in a car, and I think this is a really important point. But I'm super optimistic about quantum computing because I've been in the field for more than 20 years, and for most of that time, I would tell people that quantum computing was decades away. In fact, I had a former master's student of mine who went on to do a PhD in silicon photonics at Harvard and so on. Anyway, he said, "You told me quantum computing was 50 years away." The accusation implicit in that being, what are you doing starting a company to do this? And the answer to that was that we figured out how to use silicon photonics that Antonio just mentioned briefly, which is starting to pervade conventional computing. We figured out how to use that and thereby harness the tools of the semiconductor chip manufacturing industry, which is my contender for the crowning achievement of life on this planet to date. The things that we can do in silicon make everything else that humans do look like child's play. We're making billions of chips with billions of transistors on these ridiculously microscopic scales, and of course that's taken 50 years and $1 trillion of investment to get to that point. But my conviction for a very long time was, unless we're harnessing those tools, we're not going to build a useful quantum computer in my lifetime, because a useful quantum computer means of order 1 million qubits. And today we have various organizations, Google, IBM, universities and so on, have a dozen or several dozen. They're approaching this very exciting threshold called quantum supremacy, which is a very exciting threshold, very poorly named in my view by a brilliant colleague of mine, John Praskell at Caltech. I still think it's a poor choice of words, because all that means is that you cannot simulate your quantum system on a conventional computer. And you'll notice in making that statement that I didn't say, and it does something useful. And indeed, no one has yet figured out how to do something useful with a system of that scale. It's becoming increasingly clear that you really need this 1 million qubit scale system to do useful quantum computations, at which point the whole promise of quantum computing opens up, in particular that molecular simulation, which I think will transform every aspect of our lives, society.
Share with the room what the molecular transformation is.
Yeah, so essentially, if you want to calculate the properties of a molecule, there's no escaping quantum mechanics in that process. So almost a century of very sophisticated chemistry have come up with very clever ways to make approximations, even designing dedicated high-performance computing hardware to solve these problems. But in the end, it's one of these problems where you're traveling up an exponential curve, and the question is, how much money have you got, how much compute power can you buy, and how much patience have you got to get an answer? And large instances of those types of problems that grow exponentially, are forever beyond reach of any conventional computer that we will ever build. So even if Moore's law were to continue for another several centuries, and we somehow turned every silicon atom on our planet into a giant supercomputer, we still could not solve large instances of exponentially hard problems. And molecular simulation happens to be one of my favorite examples, but there are a whole host of examples of them. And I think molecular simulation will underpin our understanding of chemistry, of biology. It will lead to the design of new pharmaceuticals, new clean energy devices. Essentially, we live in a physical world. I had to explain to a prospective investor at some point that even if you were to upload yourself at some point, God forbid why you might like to do that, you will upload yourself to something, and that thing will be a very sophisticated computer, quantum or not, I have no idea, a very sophisticated computer built out of very sophisticated materials. There's no escaping the fact that we live in a material world, and until we get a handle on that, we're fundamentally limited.
There's your dose of techno-optimism. We can change our molecules and build new things because of it, solve all our problems. I'm very excited about that.
There's other things too, sorry.
Yeah.
So in the case of quantum but if you use the case of memory-driven computing, we're already working with entities here in Europe, the Blue Brain, the DZNE, to basically accelerate the cure of cancer for brain. And we believe in 10 years from now, we'll be able to replicate the entire brain in memory, which means you can do research real time.
In 10 years. Everyone note that. We'll come back in 10 years and make sure it's happened. Jeremy, you got away without answering what a government and a large corporation and entrepreneur should do.
Yeah, so I think what governments and large organizations should start doing is thinking seriously about it, and increasingly they are. I think a couple of years ago, I went back from Davos to say, not only was I talking about quantum computing, that's the normal thing, but CEOs of major organizations are talking about quantum computing. So I think increasingly people across all sectors are forming teams within their organization. So it's not just the CEO or CTO who wants to have a conversation with us, but increasingly they have a bunch of PhDs in math, computer science and physics and so on, who are actually figuring out precisely what they will do. And I think Amy and I were talking about this before the session. There's no mystery about the power of a quantum computer. Someone put that 1 million qubit quantum computer down here in this room this afternoon, then we could be answering profoundly important questions on an hours and days time frame with that. And so there are organizations out there who know exactly what they're going to do with these things. My contention is that we probably only know a fraction of a percent of what we're really ultimately going to do with quantum computing, in the same way that in 1950 predictions about what you would do with digital computing would have been dangerous to make. But yeah, now is the time for organizations and governments to prepare for this. And one of the things that I'm particularly passionate about is that we organize things such that the benefits that come from this very powerful technology are distributed as equitably as possible. That we really strive to deliver the benefits in a shortest amount of time, and that that those benefits flow through the system, which has not always historically been the case.
Sure, and it sounds like it's a massive investment to get to where we need to be, and our system typically rewards the people who make those investments so far. So, Amy, I want to turn to you and ask you about what you're optimistic about and what these organizations should do about it.
So I'm a quantitative futurist, and my job is to take data and use the models that I developed to figure out what the future plausibly looks like. And I just say that because most of what I do is think about risk. And I am a pragmatist. So I'm very much not a techno-optimist, but it doesn't mean that I don't see opportunity in the present. So let me give you a couple concrete examples that are actionable over the next 10 years, and then spin that out forward. The most important for everybody in this room to keep in mind is that we are in the midst of great transformation. It just doesn't feel like it because, in a sense, this is an explosion that's happening in slow motion. So, and I will also just quickly say I don't make predictions. So these are all data-driven models. So this is the beginning of the end of smartphones. 10 years from now, and there's, I won't bore you with the details, but all of the data point to the beginning of the end in the developed world. So what that implies is that as our phones retreat from the things that we put in front of our faces to essentially things that we keep in our pockets that are the connective tissue between other peripherals that we wear and that we use, that the computing environments that all of your businesses and your citizens rely on suddenly look quite different. There's a company in Florida called Magic Leap that is developing a set of spatial computing glasses. Usually when I say I've seen a company with a cool set of computer glasses, I get the eye roll. And immediately somebody says, don't you remember, right, I know. Don't you remember Google Glass and the giant failure of Google Glass? And my response to that is, if you look throughout time, it's usually not the first innovative new idea that takes off, it's the second, third, fourth iteration of that. So this would be the third iteration in the past 20 years of a computable device that we wear, where some of the compute happens on the body at the moment and some of it happens in the cloud. And essentially everything in the physical realm becomes a computable environment. And this is not so that you can see the latest tweets as you're walking by people, but instead in order to help visualize data in an entirely different way. So as a CEO, you might be in your office looking out at your staff, and you could quantify in real time their productivity. So among other things. But that implies that as computer architectures change, and there's still a question about cloud versus edge, and as we have alternate ways of offering computation, you have to start radically rethinking how you run your businesses. And most of the gigantic corporations that I advise and the governments and the leaders that I advise are not used to thinking long term. 3 years at our current juncture is a mistake for you to be focused on, because while there are things that are in flux, the decisions that you make today have longer term consequences. If you sign up with Google versus Amazon, for example, for your AI as a cloud, should you go in that direction, those systems are not interoperable. So it will become extremely difficult for you later on to untether yourself from that system. So I'm, I guess, optimistic that there are lots of new alternatives, and it's kind of an exciting time to be alive because we're the generation of people that gets to live through all of this. On the other hand, there's no global alignment around the use of data. There's no alignment in my own country about the use of data. Yes, there's tons of it. On the other hand, it's not the best possible data. So I guess I could be, on the one hand, optimistic that machine learning and deep learning will help us solve cancer. On the other hand, in a lot of countries, that data is locked in an electric medical record system governed by that country's laws. And GDPR laws are a little different than the HIPAA laws that we have in the US. One of the challenges that we have is that we have to train these systems, these learning systems today. If you don't have so the compute may be there, and the strength, the algorithms may be great, but if you don't have a good corpora to start with, you wind up with flawed results. This is what we've already seen happen. We have synthetic data. We have all this data, and yet we have to create synthetic data sets in our businesses in order to train these systems. And it turns out those synthetic data sets are leading us astray. So this is as optimistic as I can possibly get.
And we're gonna get to threats and challenges in a moment. But before we make that turn, I do want to get Antonio. I do want you to offer. I have a sense of your optimism, but if you want to nail it one more time succinctly, that'd be great. But tell us, what should a government do? What should a corporation do? What should an entrepreneur do?
Yeah, listen, I'm very excited. I mean, this is one of the most exciting times to be in this industry because everything is being transformed and being disrupted. Obviously, you have to be smart about that, but the reality is, as a leader of a company, like a Fortune 100 company, you get an opportunity of a lifetime to make a difference. And we as a company have a clear purpose, which is to advance the way we live and work. It's not just about the working aspect, but also to make a contribution to the communities. And I think these technologies, all aspects that Amy and James spoke about, and myself, also have to deliver certain outcomes to the communities. And this is where the government plays a huge role, because ultimately the business, the community, and the government have to come together in attacking specific problems. And a great example is what the World Economic Forum has done, and we launched the Tech Impact 2030, using our technology and partnership with academia, like Purdue, for example, or new startups, to go attack some problems. You know, we decided to attack two fundamental issues. One is agriculture, how to improve the quality of the crops, the yields, and the quantity. Also improve accelerate the cures. And so it's an exciting time, obviously, and the AI tools, right, are here to aid, but also there is an ethical and a moral code that has to be applied. And I know later on we're going to talk about that because you raised at the beginning, but in my view, all this is to aid the human, and through automation and everything else, not to replace the human. And then in that transition, make sure the humans also reskill themselves for different tasks, because ultimately we have a role to play.
So governments and corporations start thinking about the morals and ethics.
Absolutely, and that's why, you know, this morning we're talking about, you know, what we see here in Europe and around the globe with, we talk about here the WEF globalization 4.0, but at the same time, every country is becoming more populist and nationalist about the interest. And so you have to deal with that reality. Second is the fact, in that transition, you see the middle class being squished in the middle because they feel they are not going to be able to get to a job that's well paid. And so we get to the point about inclusion. And obviously, reskilling that workforce is super, super critical. Otherwise, they don't get to participate. We talk about the data aspect that Amy talked about it. You know, we have no standards. We have, you know, none of that, and that obviously is a big problem because there is lack of trust. You know, we live in a society now with all the data we create and what we share. We go back like 2008 in the banking system when everything crashed. We lost the faith and the trust in the banking system, and there was a lot of recovery that has to be done. Here, we need to get ahead and start building the trust on how we use this data. And the last thing was about AI, and then ultimately how these incredible technologies. She used a strong word about the six, what do you call it?
G-Mafia.
G-Mafia.
And the bats in China.
Well, and the bats, but the point is that we are concentrating too much power in few people, and innovation has to happen at all levels. And ultimately, getting some sort of policy and guidelines around the AI to manage this is going to be important. Not to regulate it, because it's hard to regulate the AI. I mean, how are you going to do that? We talk obviously to our government in the United States and what they do with data and all that, and they have the same dilemma, how they're going to use it.
All right, Amy.
Can I just pick up on that?
Lay out the hellscape.
So lay out the hellscape. Yeah. So here's so again, like within AI, the processes and the goals are not to get to a solution, because uncertainty is part of the process. So instead of getting to a singular answer, instead it's about optimization. And to your excellent point, it's a small group of people working at a very few number of companies who are making decisions about what to optimize using available data. And the challenge is, oftentimes this comes back to bias. And we tend to think of women and people of color and disenfranchised communities who are biased against, but literally everybody in this room at some point has been biased against. I'll give you a concrete example. When I back up my car into my garage, the stereo automatically turns down. I've never been in a car accident. I think I'm a pretty good driver. There's plenty of space. And yet, somebody somewhere has made a decision about how to optimize my driving experience. And that is what's baked in to the computer system that governs the car. That's one tiny example. I could spend the rest of the day giving you example after example after example. And this is the challenge. And so regulation doesn't make sense, because we shift from having a tiny group of people making decisions about optimization to a tiny group of people who are lawmakers, who are very well-read and very smart people, but overwhelmingly lack degrees in the hard sciences and technical experience. There are conversations now in the United States about how to create regulations governing the future of not just AI, but quantum would wind up getting lumped in. And part of this is because, again, most people don't have a clear enough understanding of what these systems are, what they aren't, what they actually do, what they can't do. I talked to somebody on the Hill 2 weeks ago. We just happened to be talking about quantum, and they are on the side of regulating AI and quantum, because once quantum is achieved, all of our encryption goes away. It was like, it's like so regulation doesn't work, but we also can't leave it to the big nine or to the big tech companies to figure this out either. So this is the World Economic Forum is a really good place to start much needed concrete conversations and to gain some alignment, which is going to require difficult decision making and courageous leadership under really tough circumstances.
Amy, you have me feeling like the spinning pinwheel right now. It's like the companies can't fix it, the regulators can't fix it.
So all right. So this book that I've got.
Take us out. Where do we go?
So all right. So this book that I've got coming out is an endeavor to fix this. It's called The Big Nine. But I've come up with 15 principles and a framework for a new international body, because the only way, again, like AI is it's the third era of computing, and it involves hardware, it involves data, it involves algorithms, and it is tethered to us. We are it is us. It's not some sci-fi thing that's on the horizon. And so, but this is true of all of the computing platforms and frameworks that we have in our futures. So, if we don't figure out a way to get the right people in the room and have some kind of agreement, we haven't even talked about China. If we don't come to some kind of agreement where the companies are still the heroes to their shareholders, and the governments are still the heroes to their citizens. And we figure out a way for it to be mostly win-win for everybody, then this goes nowhere. And if you go out 50 years, this is all bad for all of us.
Well, we have to, Jeremy. You've created a startup. I'm assuming you've raised capital. You are building a thing for your capital holder. Your shareholders. So, but then how do you balance that with what you're trying to build and do what you've said is very important to you, which is to make sure that the benefits are fair?
Yeah, well, it's been embedded in our DNA from the very start that we're doing this because the world needs the technology, and so we've structured things so that we're going to bring it to bear on these grand challenges and bring about these benefits. And then the process is you select shareholders and board members and employees who also are aligned with that vision. So I think it's not straightforward, but it's doable. And maybe I can come back on a couple of points here.
Please.
I think Antonio said it very clearly. You know, we want a human-centered future of computing, and I think that should be so obvious that that's what we want, right? Like, we're humans, we're designing this stuff, like, it surely should be for us. But I think we humans have a pretty poor track record of actually doing that on all fronts, right? Like, I'm pretty sure that if we sat down and thought about it, we wouldn't say, yeah, the best thing that we could do is have cars on roads crisscrossing every aspect of our lives, traveling at 50 miles an hour, right where my children are playing and so on. And, the road deaths speak to that, the faults with that design. So I think somehow between, the corporations and the governments, there are all of us humans, consumers and so on, and we have to define what it is that we want and what is good and what is bad, and I'm very excited.
But now, the problem is
now.
that technology tends to evolve in ways that we don't think about. Mm-hmm. And so everybody leaves that discussion until a point at which we're at a crisis. And we have a short amount of time. We have time right now to come to some reasonable conclusions and to do something in the present.
Maybe I can give you a couple of examples from conversations that I had.
I want to hit that, but
Yeah.
just let me announce two things. One is that questions 5 minutes or so from now. So if you would like to ask questions, get ready for that. And then I do want to get to Antonio, because a little bit you're talking about companies that are owned by shareholders, and Antonio's dealing with this.
Yeah.
But let's hear what you were about to say, and then Antonio, start thinking about an answer for that one.
Yeah. So the first thing, someone who I was at dinner with last night, their mother was a receptionist at a hospital who made the calls to say, remember that you've got an appointment tomorrow, and she's being replaced by an AI. Now I think it's a good idea to replace human drivers with AIs if they're way better at driving than humans, and they kill far fewer people. I think there's a moral imperative to do that. But the receptionist, it's far less clear, and I think back to the how much data and the quality of data, I think there's a reasonable case that if you were to measure the health outcomes, people might vastly appreciate and feel good about having a human who actually genuinely knows them and cares about them and so on interacting. So that's just one example. And then China was mentioned, and I wanted to raise this provocation. I think we've all read about, using technology to monitor citizens and give them a score and then give them rewards in return for that. And certainly the Western media have portrayed this as like the most outrageous thing that you could do with technology, and isn't this abhorrent and all the rest of it. And I guess my provocation, and I'm not arguing whether it's right or wrong, is that this is in fact what humans have been doing forever. And it was very apparent when you lived in a village of 100 people, the resources, people's behavior within that community and the resources that went to them were very correlated with one another. I think we failed to make a transition from that 100-person village to the million-plus person city and the global community.
The key difference is, you could argue, I used to live in China, so you could argue that the current social credit score is just an advancement of something culturally that's already always existed, except that a system designed by a relative few number of people in service of the CCP is now making autonomous decisions based on that data, and that is the critical difference.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm not.
And that is the cause for concern, and that's being exported as part of the BRI.
Yeah. I think the mistake that's being made is to just outright assume that this is a terrible and awful thing to do. Like, I think some of us, when we conduct our lives, in wherever we are, would like to see some repercussions for people who are throwing their rubbish and trash out the window of their car as they drive. Look, we don't have these things. So anyway, that's just a provocation.
I'm sure that in the United States we have untold systems that accrue benefits to people who behave in a certain way based on, and then get rewarded for it. Everything from mortgage approvals. And anyway, so Antonio, okay, wow. How do you balance the needs of Wall Street and shareholders with making sure this also gets out to everyone as you sort of plot the future?
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, we are for a profit company, and we have shareholders, but they're not mutually exclusive. I don't know if you read the latest, Larry Fink, which obviously is the head of BlackRock, sends a letter every year about, top of mind shareholder, thinking. And this year, shareholders are thinking more and more about purpose-driven companies. And a perfect example is our company. We have a clear purpose, which is advance the way we live and work. And so shareholders care about this. And they care about you winning the right way, making a difference in the community, and yes, make a profit. So when you actually bring all together and you bring that intersection in a balanced way, actually everybody wins. So I don't think there's any exclusivity. Actually, are totally inclusive against each other.
Yeah. And I would say we think about this too. I mean, we think about how content is consumed, and it's served to you based on decisions of AI and algorithms. And there are ways that media companies all over, because of they're kind of strapped for revenue right now, are gaming those systems to just get time spent with their content rather than time well spent, which I think is ultimately dissatisfying for the people who do it, and it's bad for everybody. So
I'd like to print that on a bumper sticker. That's my
Yeah.
big takeaway from WEF. Time spent versus time well spent.
it's not mine. I stole it from a guy named Tristan Harris. But
Was that Tristan?
Yeah.
I didn't realize.
but it's great. So okay, let's go to questions. Do we have questions?
Thank you so much. This is very insightful. I'm a member of the European Parliament, and I think very much about what we can do now before it's too late to make sure that the rule of law has any meaning still, and that we use the time well to act now. And what I've been missing a little bit, and maybe it's because we're at the World Economic Forum with a lot of private sector, is there's a sort of common appreciation for the notion that politicians don't understand tech, and it's not easy to keep up. That's why I'm here. But what I'm missing is that a lot of companies don't think about governance, don't think about human rights, don't think about democracy, don't think about the possible abuse of their products. I mean, I hear when I hear mottos, we're going to improve the lives of people, etc. But we can define that in a gazillion different ways. And I think some kind of minimal threshold to protect people, to safeguard human rights or fair competition or, public health or basic principles is key. So can we think a little bit about how we can spend that time and how we can also invite politicians and lawmakers to understand tech better instead of just saying, wah, wah, you don't get it?
The problem is that if the squishy computers in our heads require the same kinds of tools and data to make decisions that real-world physical computers do. And therefore, if there's not a series of very strict regulations that's clearly defined, and if there's not some kind of culture of thinking in a different way, then nobody's incentivized to do what you're asking, which is how we wound up with the GDPR. The challenge with something like the GDPR is that I don't understand how it's not completely outdated 5 years from now. And that would be tiny compared to guardrails, whatever you want to call it, governing all of these new computing interfaces. And we've only really talked about quantum and AI. Is it okay that I keep talking about edge versus cloud? I think, right? There's a bunch of other computing infrastructures and technologies like biotech, right? And lots of other things. So the best way forward is to create some kind of framework that the key people on all sides of this, including philosophers and ethicists, can all sort of agree to, and then have some kind of mechanism that incentivizes everybody to play fairly.
Not to put you on the spot, but a guardrail. What's a suggestion? Like, what's maybe a human right almost?
Well, an easy one. So one of the big problems that we have is that a lot of these technologies are driven necessarily by investment. And unfortunately, investors aren't patient. Huge companies that are creating, you guys are changing, you're helping to change computing architecture. that's insane, right? That's a hugely complicated, difficult task, and it takes time. The challenge is that if you don't show up at your annual conference with a bunch of new dazzling products and services, everybody assumes that you're failing somehow. This stuff takes time, which means investors need to offer more time. But also, I think investors should allow these companies, or we can require it somehow, to sock away some of that funding to model risk, so that we don't wind up many years later saying, well, how did we get to this point, right? So that we have a way and money to model it out in advance and then hedge against that as decisions are made going forward.
Antonio, what would be a guardrail?
Yeah, I think, well, I want to take a different approach.
Okay.
We as a company have a set of values that we live every day. And when we said, our purpose to improve the way we live and work is also give back to the community. I was just in another panel talking about human slavery. And I'm very vocal about this, and obviously it's a problem. It's a big problem. 40 million people have been forced labor every year. And so the point is that it takes government and business, and the business has a big role here. Generally speaking, when the business takes leadership, people will follow, but the government has to come along, and we have to educate both sides of the fence to get to the right outcome. I do believe the best innovation in history, at least in the last 150 years, is when both the government and the business had a common objective, and the funding problem and the incentives were all aligned in a certain way. And for example, we had a mission to go to the moon. Okay, well, it was a government-driven mission, but the business was the one, together with the government, can happen. And from there, we drove many other innovations. So I think in the end, it requires transparency, it requires partnership, it requires goodwill, it requires leadership, obviously. And then a guardrail is always about what is the right way to get this done without stopping the innovation. And AI, in my way, you can't regulate AI. What you can do is establish guiding principles with standards that you can drive this forward for the better good. And ultimately, as I said before, you have leadership that are ethical in this space.
Not to be a nag, but what's a guiding principle you think that should guide us in the...
Well, I mean, how you use this, she made the point, only 6 or 9, have the power to define what that is, and I think that's an issue, because ultimately cultural aspects come to play, right? I mean, one thing is to do in the United States, and one thing is to do it potentially in China, and so, but there are fundamental principles that should be laid out as a consistent way to do it, and I'm not a policymaker, I'm not. What I'm just saying, what is the ethical values of what we do, and live to those values as best as you can.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Okay. Shall I take it?
Sure.
You just mentioned China, but then you haven't kind of elaborated on the point. And has Europe gone completely out of the picture when it comes to innovation in computing?
So I would decouple innovation from the conversation that I was having. I think there's plenty of innovation throughout Europe. I think within this narrow space, which happens to be incredibly weighty, the United States and China have outsized influence. So the challenge, and again, this is for every leader who's in this room, now is a good time to start thinking outside of to force yourself to start making connections. The development of tools and systems and frameworks, the reliance on corpora, the data gathering mechanisms that are intended to mine, refine, productize, and monetize our data, they're fundamentally different approaches in the US and in China. The G Mafia are publicly traded companies. They have shareholder responsibility. And for the most part, there's no relationship between Silicon Valley and the US. I could point to very few examples where there's some great people doing interesting things. Even Eric Schmidt, former chairman of Google, has been doing tremendous civic work and trying to make some inroads in Washington, D.C. But overwhelmingly, the relationship is either gone, it's not there, or it's antagonistic. Therefore, the market is driving progress in AI, and oftentimes what the market wants is not what's best for the longer future of humanity. In China, I see AI and the activities of the BAT as, although they are independent companies, it is China. So you are still, to some extent, beholden to the leadership of the CCP and to Beijing. And it is really hard not to see what's happening with the BRI and the 58 countries that are part of the sort of digital Silk Road, and the expansion in fiber and 5G, and the expansion in e-commerce, and the relationship that Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu play, and not start to see how an entirely new world order is being formed right now in the present. As an American and somebody who cares a lot about Western democracy and free markets, that makes me pretty nervous. And one of the models that I've built, if we go out 20 years, 30 years or so, it's not implausible to think that the United States and our allies, UK, Australia, are locked out economically, that we are literally shut off from those BRI countries. And part of what helps propel that is the advancement of AI, which is why I love the fact that the European Parliament is thinking about some of these questions and that we're talking about guiding principles, but the time for only talking about this has to be done. We have to start taking meaningful action in the present.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question, but maybe one or two. Yes, sir.
Well, I just wanted to point out that one of the things that I've not heard talked about is that some of the worst abuses of this technology could be done by governments, and especially the military, right? So we have these very powerful technologies, and when you think about how they might harm humanity, the entities that are able to take decisions that have really, really big impacts on entire populations are governments. And so as we think about what is the ethical use of technology, and how should we be designing technology, it seems to me that that conversation needs to be had. It's not only about the corporations and what they do.
And it's also corporations working with the military. Anybody have anything to add to that? Or?
I think you're right, absolutely right. I mean, that's obviously is a debate that has to take place, but in the end, we as a corporations also have to have a point of view in that debate. It's not just selling systems and we just disappear, right? And so I think this is obviously a very hard topic that ultimately the government has to come forward. And by the way, they are, because they are asking us, how you think about using technology like AI? What is the moral code? How far we should go? Because ultimately, it's not just the government, it's the person that presses the key that ultimately has that moral dilemma. Because one thing is to say the government as a whole, but then if I'm in front of the keyboard, I have to have a clarity what I'm allowed to do and not allowed to do as a citizen, right? And that's a debate that's taking place. It's maybe not visible to people, but I can tell you there is a lot of conversation about these things.
It was interesting watching companies like Amazon and Google deal with how they interact with the government. Their employees are protesting in some cases.
The United States, our military in the United States has always had partnerships with large technology companies. This is nothing new. The nature of warfare has certainly become more complicated. We live in you made an excellent point about nationalization or nationalism and polarization. And it's an era of social media. So one of the challenges is that it's become very difficult to have, again, this is another one of those difficult conversations that quickly spirals out of control once it hits social media. And again, this is just yet another thing that everybody in this room should be thinking about. Don't put off that type of thinking and planning. It's good to be meeting quarterly and thinking about the risk implications and the scenarios, but also how does the work that you might be doing with the military or government align with the core values of your organization?
I mean, we've seen AI weaponized in media against governments and elections in the past few years already, right? Okay, so let's turn this, is there more questions? More questions? Okay, let's turn this to one last, yes, sir. Oh, okay, 5 minutes, right. Last, I wanted to turn to sustainability. You brought up a stat that I found remarkable, which is that 6% of the world's power is used for computing?
Yeah, it's used to power the data centers.
Right.
Whether it's your own data center or one of the G9 data centers, that's the fact. 96% of that power is consumed there. And so the question is, in the future of computing, which is the topic today, how we address that problem. We address that problem, we address the cost problem, we address the scalability problem in a way that's sustainable. So we as a company, we made a commitment by 2025 to reduce carbon emission by 30 times. So that's an example. That means that we have to innovate in different ways. You know, is your supply chain is not just the system side of this, but is an end-to-end supply chain from the time you procure minerals to build the components, to build the systems, to recycle the system. We actually bring here what we call the circular economy, because ultimately some of these systems still have tremendous value for other corporations, and we find a second life. In fact, today, we can prove today, at least in our company, only 0.5% goes to waste. The other 99.5% has a different life. Whether we resell the system or we turn the system into parts for service events, but only 0.5%, right? And we actually recycle 4 million units in large systems. I'm not talking about PCs and that. We're talking about large rack systems, which is the largest operation on the planet.
Amy and Jeremy, sustainability and the challenge that, you know, as we turn our lives more and more over to these power-hungry machines?
I mean, I can just quickly say something about the data side of this. So a lot of people don't know this, but all the big data centers, you know, everybody who's storing your data still backs up at some point to magnetic tape. And there's 2 companies in the world who produce that tape. They're in Japan. It's Fuji and Sony. And they're constantly battling with each other over patents. And we are creating so much data that it's becoming harder and harder to back it all up and store it. So there's some interesting new research into storing data in synthetic DNA, among other places, which could potentially use far less energy in the future. But if, you know, what happens if our synthetic data goes the way of mini disks? Right? It becomes harder and harder to retrieve that when we need to later on. So.
Jeremy, I feel like you could return us to some optimism about what quantum can do.
Yeah. So, you know, my personal mission is about you know, sustaining human life on this planet. We are looking at the 10 billionth person to be living on this planet, and as I said at the outset, you could be pessimistic about our activities in terms of using finite resources. And I think it's clear that we need to figure out how to optimally use those resources, both physical and virtual, far more than we have, and in fact far more than we will ever be able to without quantum computing. So it's in that sense that I think quantum computing is really a necessary tool for inventing our future across the whole spectrum. You know, energy being just one of the, you know, new materials, new clean energy devices, room temperature superconductors for the distribution of power, but also just the materials that we build our world out of. I think it's absolutely clear to me that the runway that we have as humans on this planet is that much longer when we develop quantum computing.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, some lessons I learned today, just I think the biggest one is that we need to start thinking about these problems now, and that we need to put down on paper and say what our principles are, what our guardrails are, what's important to us as we kind of develop and get to a model of a new brain in 10 years and get to 1 million qubits, which we need to do anything. And so thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.